They laughed when Leah Mercer led 42 goats into a drainage ditch. Not a pasture, not a brush lot. A ditch. A long, ugly farm drain on the west edge of Oregon's Willamette Valley, choked with blackberry canes, reed grass, plastic feed sacks, dead willow limbs, and the kind of mud that grabs a boot and keeps it. By the time the winter storm arrived, everyone understood what she had been doing. But in October, all they saw was a 27-year-old woman in a rain jacket, unrolling orange electric netting beside a ditch that nobody respected. 42 goats spilled out of the trailer like trouble with hooves. They climbed the bank. They chewed through blackberry leaves. They stuck their heads into places no mower could reach. And on the county road above them, 2 neighboring farmers slowed their pickups just to stare. One of them said, "Mercer finally hired the cheapest ditch crew in Oregon." The other one laughed so hard he nearly missed the turn. Leah heard them. She did not wave. She just tightened the fence, checked the battery on the charger, and wrote the date on the clipboard in her hand. October 11. Ditch Section 1. Goats introduced. Brush density heavy. Culvert visibility poor. 3 months later, after the rain came down for 4 days and the low fields started filling like bathtubs, those notes were not funny anymore. By Monday morning, the drainage road was gone under brown water. The Keller hazelnut block had 18 acres sitting wet around the trunks. A blueberry field near Bell Station lost its access lane because water jumped the ditch and cut through the gravel shoulder. At Harrow Creek Farms, a tractor with dual tires sank so deep into a soft lane that the front axle disappeared into mud. And across from the Mercer place, a blocked culvert turned an ordinary grass seed field into a shallow lake. People said it was the storm. People said it was bad timing. People said no one could have done much about that much water. But at the Mercer farm, the main ditch was full, loud and ugly. It was also moving. That was the difference. It was moving. Leah Mercer had not beaten the storm. She had given the water an exit before the storm arrived. And that is the part most people did not understand until their own fields were already underwater. Leah grew up on 69 acres outside a small town that had more farm trucks than traffic lights. Her father, Mark Mercer, raised hazelnuts, leased ground for grass seed, and kept 2 small blueberry blocks because Leah's mother had insisted on them before she died. Mark was 58, broad through the shoulders, careful with money, and allergic to any idea that sounded like it had been invented by someone wearing clean shoes. He knew the land the way some men know their own hands. He knew which gate sagged in wet weather. He knew which pump coughed before it failed. He knew where the ground stayed green too long in spring. But the ditch along the west edge of the farm had become one of those things he saw so often that he stopped seeing it. It ran nearly half a mile from the back hazelnut block to a drainage district canal. In summer, it looked harmless. A dark line behind the fence, a place where blackberries grew thick, frogs hid in the grass, and old irrigation pipe had been stacked so long it became part of the scenery. Every fall, Mark ran the brush mower along the top where the ground was flat. Every few years, he hired a man with an excavator to clean the worst bend, and for a long time that felt like enough. Then Leah came home. She had spent 2 years working for a soil and water district after college, inspecting farm drains, culverts, low crossings, and tile outlets for people who usually called only after something had already failed. She had seen a flooded field that was not really caused by rain. It was caused by 4 feet of blackberry roots wrapped around a culvert screen. She had seen a road washout because an old willow limb had been trapped in weeds for 6 months, waiting for high water. She had seen pumps run all night while the real blockage sat 20 yards away under a green mat of grass. So when she walked the Mercer ditch in September, she did not see weeds. She saw a slow failure wearing leaves. One evening, she spread a printed farm map across the kitchen table. Mark was eating stew out of a chipped bowl. The radio was on low. Leah circled the west ditch with a red pencil. "We have to open this before the heavy rain starts," she said. Mark did not look up. "I cut it every year. You cut the top. That is where the mower fits." "Exactly." He looked at her then. Leah tapped the map. "The banks are packed with blackberry. The lower channel has reed grass through half the bends. 3 tile outlets are buried. I could only see 2 of the 6 culvert mouths." Mark set down his spoon. "That ditch has carried water since before you were born." Leah nodded. "That is why everyone trusts it." "And you don't?" "I trust it when it has a path." Mark leaned back. He knew that tone. It was not the tone Leah used when she wanted permission. It was the tone she used when she had already done the math. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "Targeted grazing first." He stared at her. "No, not loose goats, managed sections, temporary fence, 2 or 3 days per cell. They strip the banks, open the sight lines, and then we bring in equipment only where the ditch actually needs digging." Mark's face did not change. "Goats are not a drainage plan." Leah took a breath. "No," she said. "Goats are how we find the drainage plan." A week later, Leah made the mistake of explaining the same idea at the drainage co-op meeting. It was held in the back room of the feed store, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired and suspicious. There were folding chairs, paper cups of coffee, and a whiteboard with last month's canal fees still written in the corner. Leah brought maps. That alone made half the room uneasy. She talked about clogged culverts. She talked about brush load. She talked about how the past few winters had not been predictable. Long, dry stretches, then hard bursts of rain, then saturated ground with nowhere left to put the water. She explained that the Mercer ditch was not the only one at risk. Several farms on the lower side of the road depended on small drains staying open before the district canal could carry water away. She had barely finished when Darryl Knox raised his hand. Darryl owned a brush mower, a compact excavator, and a business built on the phrase, "I'll clear what your mower can't." He was not cruel. He was just used to being the answer. "You telling us goats are replacing equipment now?" he asked. A few men laughed before Leah could answer. "No," Leah said. "I'm saying there are places equipment shouldn't touch until we know what is under the brush." Darryl folded his arms. "Goats don't know a culvert from a coffee can." "No," Leah said, "but they know how to make one visible." That got a bigger laugh. Someone near the door said, "Next she'll put chickens on the pump station." Leah looked down at her map so they would not see her jaw tighten. She had expected questions. She had not expected to feel 12 years old again. But ridicule has a useful quality when a person is stubborn enough. It makes the cost of being wrong very clear. From that day forward, Leah could not pretend the goats were just an experiment. If it failed, every man in that room would remember it. If it worked, they would remember that too. So she made it hard to dismiss. She hired the goats from Rosa Ibarra, a grazing contractor who ran small crews through vineyards, fire breaks, and weed-heavy rights-of-way. Rosa arrived in a dented white pickup with a livestock trailer, 2 dogs, and a calm expression that made Mark suspicious. The goats came out loud, bony, and offended by the weather. One immediately tried to climb the trailer gate. Another bit the sleeve of Leah's rain jacket. Mark watched from beside the shop. "These are the professionals." Rosa glanced at the goats. "They don't need to be polite," she said. "They need to be hungry." Leah divided the ditch into 12 sections. She did not turn the goats loose on the farm. She fenced 250 feet at a time. She wrapped the young blueberry canes near the lower end. She flagged every soft bank. She marked culverts with blue stakes. She kept the goats out of the grass seed ground and away from the hazelnut trunks. She checked the fence at dawn and again before dark. She took photographs from the same points each day. Before, after, bank left, bank right, culvert face, outlet condition, brush load, sediment pocket. She was not trying to make the ditch look tidy. She was trying to make it readable. And the goats did exactly what she needed. They ate the blackberry leaves first, then the wild rose, then the reed grass along the slope. They reached down into the banks where the mower could not go without tipping. They pulled dead vines off the fence. They opened lines of sight that had been closed for years. By the fourth day, Mark stopped making jokes. By the seventh, he followed Leah down the ditch in the evening without being asked. By the 10th, he pointed to a dark half-circle under a mat of roots and said, "I forgot that tile outlet was there." Leah wrote it down. Mark looked at the clipboard. "Do you write down everything?" "Only the things we forgot." That one landed harder than she meant it to. Mark walked ahead of her for the rest of the ditch. The worst section was behind the old equipment shed. That bend had always been a problem, but nobody understood how bad it was until the goats stripped the bank bare. Under the brush, Leah found a culvert mouth nearly sealed by sediment, not blocked by one dramatic log, not destroyed, just narrowed. Year by year, root by root, storm by storm, the opening that should have taken a hard flow of water had been squeezed down to a gap about the width of a shovel blade. Darryl Knox came out with his excavator after Leah sent photos. He climbed down into the ditch, looked at the exposed culvert, and gave a low whistle. "Your goats find that?" "They uncovered it." He scratched his chin. "Would have taken me twice as long to find it under all that brush." Leah said nothing. Darryl looked at her. "Don't get proud. I still think it's ridiculous, I know." He cleaned 3 sediment pockets, opened the bend, and reshaped a short section where water had been cutting the bank. The actual machine work took 5 hours, not 5 days, because the goats had already done the slow, awkward work of exposing the problem. That was the system Leah had been trying to explain. Goats did not replace the excavator. They made the excavator smarter. By Thanksgiving, the Mercer ditch looked raw, scraped, and unimpressive. But it was visible. Every culvert mouth had a stake. Every weak bank had flagging. Every tile outlet was cleared enough to see. Mark kept pretending he had not changed his mind, but he started carrying the ditch map behind the seat of his truck. Then the January rain missed them. 2 storms went north. One broke apart before it reached the valley. The ditch stayed quiet. The neighbors who had laughed in October started laughing again. At the parts counter, someone asked Mark whether the goats were on salary. At the feed store, Darryl said, "Maybe they can file taxes too." Mark came home irritated and told Leah people were still talking. Leah looked up from her notes. "Good," she said. "That means they remember the ditch exists." But privately, she felt the pressure. The problem with preparing for a disaster is that nothing happening can make you look foolish. Every dry week made the goats look less like foresight and more like an expensive joke. Rosa's invoice sat on Mark's desk. The fence charger needed repair. One goat had escaped through a low spot and eaten the top off a neighbor's ornamental shrub, creating a diplomatic incident that Mark referred to as the rhododendron crisis. Leah had spent money before the farm had a problem, and that is one of the hardest arguments in agriculture. Fixing broken things feels responsible. Maintaining invisible systems feels optional, until it isn't. In late February, the forecast changed. The first alert called for 2 inches of rain, then 3. Then a warm front on top of cold ground, then wind, then a second band of rain behind the first. By Friday afternoon, the sky had the flat gray look that makes old farmers check gates without being told. Rain started after dark. By Saturday morning, the ditch was running. By Saturday night, the ground had stopped taking water. By Sunday, every low place in the valley had become a test. At the Keller place, a culvert behind the hazelnuts caught a woven mat of dead grass and blackberry cane. Water backed through the young block and stood in the rows. At Harrow Creek, 2 workers tried to clear a ditch crossing with shovels while rain ran down their sleeves. The water was already over the tops of their boots. Across the road from the Mercers, a grass seed field turned silver under the stormlight. The farmer brought a tractor down to pull debris from the crossing, but the lane failed under the front tires. The machine sat there, engine idling, wheels sunk, water running around it like it was just another rock. Mark woke Leah before dawn on Monday. She was already dressed. Neither of them said much. They drove the farm lane in the pickup, wipers slapping hard, headlights catching sheets of rain. When they reached the west ditch, Mark stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. The ditch was high, higher than Leah had ever seen it. Brown water filled the channel from bank to bank. Foam collected at the bends. Grass bent flat under the current. The sound was not pretty. It was the sound of a system working at its limit, but it was working. The water was moving hard toward the district canal. It did not spread into the hazelnuts. It did not climb into the blueberries. It did not sit against the roots and wait. Leah stepped out into the rain. Mark followed with a rake. At the first culvert, water pushed through clean. At the second, clean. At the third, a wad of sticks had caught on the corner of the screen. Mark leaned over, hooked it with the rake, and pulled. The water dropped several inches in the upstream pocket and surged forward. Mark stood there with rain running off the brim of his hat. For once he had no comment ready. Leah watched the ditch take the water away. Then Mark said, almost too quietly to hear over the rain, "They didn't know anything about drainage." Leah looked at him. "No," she said, "they just ate what was hiding it." The storm moved east by Tuesday. The sun came out pale and cold, and people started driving the roads to count what the water had taken. That is a grim kind of neighborly habit. You do not slow down because you want to stare at someone else's damage. You slow down because next time it might be yours. The Mercer farm was wet, the lanes were soft, the ditch banks were scarred. A low corner of the grass seed lease held standing water for half a day. But the hazelnuts were not drowned. The blueberries were not sitting in a pond. The main road had not cut through. Across the valley, the story was different. One farmer spent 2 days pumping water out of a block that should have drained by itself. Another lost a gravel crossing. Another found 3 tile outlets buried under grass after the water had already gone around them. By Thursday, people stopped laughing in public. By Friday, they started asking Leah questions in private. How long did the goats stay? How much fence did she use? Did they eat the trees? Could they handle blackberry in winter? Did she feed them? Could they work along a district canal? How did she know where to put the excavator? Did she have the map? Could they borrow the map? 2 weeks later, the drainage co-op meeting was packed. Storm damage improves attendance better than any reminder email. Leah stood under the same fluorescent lights with a laptop, a stack of photos, and one muddy blue stake she had pulled from the ditch to make a point. Darryl Knox sat in the second row. Mark stood in the back, arms folded, trying to look like he had nothing to do with any of it. Leah did not start by saying the goats saved the farm. That would have made the room defensive. She started with the water. She showed the ditch map, 12 sections, 6 culverts, 4 tile outlets, 3 sediment pockets, 2 soft banks, 1 high-risk bend behind the equipment shed. She showed before photos from October, when the ditch looked green and harmless. Then she showed fought after photos, when the channel looked rough but open. She showed the 5 hours of excavator work after grazing. She showed the storm photos. She showed where water had dropped after Mark cleared the small jam. Then she showed the cost: goat rental, temporary fence, labor, excavator, repair. The number was not tiny, but it was smaller than 1 drowned block of young hazelnuts, smaller than a washed-out lane. smaller than running pumps for 2 days while the real blockage sat under brush. Darrell raised his hand. One storm doesn't prove your system. Leah nodded. You're right. The room quieted. She clicked to the next slide. That's why I'm not showing you one storm. I'm showing you what we found before the storm had a chance to find it for us. That was the line that changed the room, not because it was clever. Because everyone in that room had a ditch, a crossing, a screen, a gate, a low spot, or an outlet they had stopped noticing. Leah continued. I'm not saying goats are magic. I'm not saying equipment doesn't matter. I'm saying equipment works better when maintenance shows it where to work. We keep treating drainage like an emergency service. It has to become a preseason habit. No one laughed. A farmer named Peter Lusk, who had lost part of a road shoulder in the storm, raised his hand. So, what do we do first? Leah picked up the muddy blue stake. Walk the ditch while it's dry, she said. Not after the forecast turns bad. Not with water over the road. Walk it when it looks boring. Mark what you can't see. Mark what is holding brush. Mark the culverts. Mark the outlets. Then decide what needs goats, what needs a mower, and what needs a machine. Darrell leaned back and sighed. That's a lot of work. Leah looked at him. Only compared to pretending it isn't. By spring, the co-op had a drainage inspection day. They did not call it the GOAT program. Not at first. That would have been too humiliating for several men who were still recovering from being wrong. They called it preseason flow management. Leah let them have the name. She cared more about the walking. 9 farms mapped their drainage lines that year. Rosa brought goats to 6. Darrell cleaned the exposed sediment pockets on 4. A fencing supplier started keeping extra netting in stock because farmers who once mocked electric fence were suddenly asking how many rolls fit in a pickup bed. The drainage district sent a field tech to observe and left with copies of Leah's section sheets. The work was not perfect. Goats are never perfect. One got its head stuck in a fence panel and screamed like a wounded opera singer until Rosa freed it. 3 escaped into a harvested grass field and behaved as if they had discovered paradise. 1 climbed onto Darrell's excavator track and refused to move, which Darrell considered a personal insult. But the ditches opened. Culverts reappeared. Farmers began to learn which parts of their drainage systems were real and which parts were only assumptions covered in green growth. And Mark Mercer, who had once said goats were not a drainage plan, began marking ditch walks on the shop calendar. He never admitted Leah had changed his mind. That was not his style. But in October, when a neighbor asked whether the goats had been worth it, Mark looked toward the west ditch and said, "Water needs a door. Turns out they chew one open pretty well." For Mark, that was practically a sermon. The Mercer ditch is still not beautiful. That matters. Because the point was never beauty. In July, the banks are dusty and uneven. In November, the grass comes back. Blackberries try again because blackberries always try again. Nothing on a farm stays fixed just because a person was right once. But now the ditch is visible. Blue stakes mark the culverts. Small painted posts mark the tile outlets. The high-risk bend has a gravel access point. The maintenance schedule hangs beside the fuel log in the shop. Every fall, Leah walks the ditch with boots, gloves, a shovel, and a clipboard that has become famous in the wrong circles. Some years, she brings Rosa's goats back. Some years, a mower is enough. Some years, Darrell brings the excavator. That may be the most important part. Leah never thought the goats were the answer to everything. She thought attention was the answer. The goats were one way to force attention onto a system people had learned to ignore. A farm is full of quiet systems like that. A ditch, a fence, a tile line, a culvert, a hedgerow, a pump that starts slowly, a crossing that sinks a little more each winter, a patch of brush that looks harmless until it catches the branch that catches the grass, that stops the water, that floods the field. Most failures do not begin as disasters. They begin as things everyone walks past. The second winter after the big storm, the valley got another hard rain. Not as bad, still enough to test the low ground. At the Mercer farm, water ran brown and steady through the west ditch. Leah and Mark stood beside the culvert behind the equipment shed, the one that had once been nearly sealed under roots. On the far bank, goats worked through a short grazing cell. Bells clinked. Rain dripped from blackberry thorns. The ditch carried water the way a ditch is supposed to carry water. Mark watched for a long time. Then he said, "They still look ridiculous." Leah smiled. "They are ridiculous." He nodded toward the moving water. "But they're useful. That's better than looking serious and failing." Mark turned his head, almost smiling. "You're getting harder to live with. I learned from you." For a while, they listened to the water. Across the road, the neighbor's grass field held a few puddles, but the crossing was clear. Down the valley, more blue stakes stood beside culverts that used to be invisible. The co-op still argued about money, weather, labor, and whose responsibility the old district canal really was. Farmers do not become saints because one ditch worked, but they had learned enough to look before the rain, enough to understand that drainage is not what you fix after the water rises. It is what you protect while the ground is still dry. And the goats kept eating. They did not know they had been laughed at. They did not know their work had been debated under fluorescent lights, measured on maps, or entered into a spreadsheet by a woman who refused to be embarrassed. They did not know anyone had called them a joke. They just lowered their heads and took one mouthful after another. The water kept moving because the path had been cleared before the sky opened. The trees stayed alive because their roots could breathe. The fields dried because someone looked at a ditch in October and imagined what it would have to survive in February. They laughed when Leah Mercer put goats in the ditch. Then the rain came. The tractors sank. The culverts clogged. The fields filled. And the valley learned that water is not impressed by horsepower, experience, or pride. Water only cares whether it has somewhere to go. Leah had given it somewhere to go.